When we picture pirates, there's this really strong image, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Swashbuckling, maybe freedom, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Maybe
Yeah.
a bit chaotic, yeah, but ultimately sort of free and equal. But if you really stop and think about it, could that actually work on a ship full of, well, let's be honest, outlaws?
It's a good question. It seems unlikely on the surface.
So let's unpack this. This deep dive is all about getting past those, romantic legends and looking at the real structure of pirate life. What was really going on?
And what's fascinating as we start digging into this is the sheer amount of material we actually have to work with. It's quite surprising.
Right. Not just stories.
No, not just stories. We're going to be leaning pretty heavily on a detailed academic study, a thesis actually, that looked at real pirate shipboard rules. They called them their articles.
Articles. Okay.
Yeah, and this is from the Golden Age of Piracy, so roughly 1660 to, say, 1730. And this thesis, it does a fascinating job comparing how these pirate societies worked compared to the legitimate maritime world they came from.
So comparing them to the Navy or merchant ships.
Exactly. And we also have Captain Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates from 1724. Now that one's, well, it's colorful, definitely, but it gives us a contemporary view.
It makes sensational, maybe.
Could be,
Yeah.
yeah. But still valuable. And then, of course, we'll weave in insights from other historical analyses and even some firsthand accounts like trial records and things like that.
Okay, so the big question for you as we dive in is really, how did these pirate communities actually work? Were they these radical egalitarian havens we sometimes imagine? Or was the reality, well, something else?
Something more complicated, probably.
Our mission here is to try and uncover the surprising ways their society mirrored and sometimes sharply contrasted with the more, let's say, conventional world of the 17th and 18th centuries.
And right off the bat, that image of the pirate as some kind of revolutionary, well, our core source material challenges that pretty directly.
Oh, really? How so?
The thesis argues pretty strongly that the social practices you saw on pirate ships weren't some sudden new invention based on radical ideas.
No.
No. Instead, they were deeply rooted in the pirates' own past experiences in, legitimate seafaring. Whether they'd served on merchant ships or even in the Navy, they basically copied what they knew.
But it's interesting because you do hear those arguments, don't you? The pirates were almost creating a better, fairer world on their ships compared to the one they left behind.
You do. Historians like Christopher Hill, J.S. Bromley, Marcus Rediker, they've definitely pointed to evidence suggesting some pirates held pretty radical political, maybe even religious views.
Suggesting they weren't just common criminals, but maybe rebels against the system.
That's the argument, yeah. Individuals rebelling against the strict hierarchies and, frankly, the terrible conditions common back then. Rediker especially makes a strong case for seeing pirates as partly resisting the exploitative nature of early capitalism.
Right, fighting back against low wages and harsh discipline.
Exactly. But when you really dig into the evidence, particularly the structure of these articles we mentioned, the overwhelming motivation seems much more, well, practical.
Money.
Yeah, the potential for significant financial gain, the chance to get rich and get rich fast, much faster than they ever could, scrubbing decks or hauling ropes. That was a huge, huge pull.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. What about the role of black pirates? There's this idea that pirate ships offered opportunities they just wouldn't find anywhere else at the time.
Kincor's work on that is really interesting. He suggests the significant presence of Black crew members, and even some in leadership positions, that does point towards a kind of unique social experiment, as he calls it.
More equality there.
More than ashore, almost certainly. But even Kincor stopped short of calling pirate society a fully realized, alternative social order. While Black sailors probably found more freedom, more opportunity on a pirate ship compared to the incredibly racist systems back on land, it wasn't a perfect egalitarian utopia for everyone involved. The main focus, remember, was always the success of the venture, the piratical enterprise itself.
Got it. So if this picture of total equality isn't quite right, how did they actually organize themselves to, get anything done? Which brings us back to these articles. What were they exactly, and why were they so important?
Okay, think of the articles as the fundamental laws of their little shipboard society. They were the rules.
The rule book.
Pretty much. They established order, governed behavior, laid out everything from how captured loot would be split.
Ah, the important stuff.
Absolutely. Right down to how arguments between crewmates would be settled. It was basically the social contract holding this pretty diverse group of individuals together in a very high-stakes, dangerous environment.
Where did they even get the idea for having these rules? It sounds surprisingly formal, for a bunch of guys operating outside the law.
Well, they didn't just invent it out of thin air. Their backgrounds were key. Many came from privateering.
Which was basically legal piracy, right? State-sponsored.
Essentially, yes. Government-sanctioned raiding. So privateering and just general maritime service would have shown them you need shipboard regulations. Things fall apart otherwise.
Makes sense.
So typically, a pirate crew would draw up these articles right when they first banded together, when they needed to establish how things are going to work. And interestingly, these weren't like set in stone. No, they could be revised. If the crew felt the rules weren't working or needed changing, they could vote to change them.
So we actually have examples, like written down copies of these pirate constitutions. That's pretty amazing.
We do, yeah. We have surviving examples of articles from the crews of some really famous pirates. Bartholomew Roberts, Thomas Enstice, Edward Lowe. Their articles have survived.
Wow.
And these documents, they give us this incredible window into how these self-governing communities actually function day to day.
And how do they make sure everyone actually followed the rules? Was it just signing your name and hoping for the best?
Usually anyone joining the crew, and this includes men who were forced, press-ganged.
Right. Not everyone volunteered.
No. So volunteers and forced men alike, they'd generally be required to sign, or if they couldn't write, make their mark on the articles.
Okay.
And according to some accounts, this wasn't always a polite request. There are stories of it happening with a pistol literally held to their head.
Whoa. Okay, so much for volunteering freely.
Right. By agreeing, or being forced to agree, they were formally submitting to the authority of the crew and its established laws.
Definitely puts a damper on the romantic image of joining a pirate crew.
It makes you wonder, though, who was even able to read these things? Literacy wasn't exactly universal back then.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And no, not every pirate was literate, but reading and writing were necessary skills for certain jobs, just like on any other ship.
Like the captain.
The captain needed to read charts, yeah.
Yeah.
And the quartermaster often kept the accounts, the records of the plunder. So some literacy was essential in leadership.
But not everyone.
Not everyone. But interestingly, there was also sometimes a bit of distrust towards written documents among some pirates.
They worried that these very articles, the proof they'd signed on, could be used as evidence against them if they were captured and put on trial.
Ah, incriminating evidence.
Exactly. There's even one story, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, of pirates throwing books overboard because they feared the trouble written words could cause them down the line.
Talk about fear of the written word.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, the article set the rules, but who was actually in charge, making sure they were followed? What did the leadership look like? Was the captain the absolute dictator we sometimes see in movies?
Not always, no. While the captain definitely held significant authority, especially, during a chase or in battle where you need clear, decisive leadership.
Makes sense.
Their power wasn't absolute. It wasn't unchecked.
Yeah.
In many pirate companies, the captain was actually elected by the crew.
Elected. Seriously, that sounds surprisingly democratic for a band of thieves.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, it wasn't universal, but it was a common practice. Of course, some captains might have got the job through a mutiny, or maybe they were the original owner of the ship before it turned pirate.
Okay, but election was common. Why? What was the thinking there?
Well, it was a way for the crew to have a direct say in who was leading them, especially when it came to big decisions like where to go raiding, what ships to attack, how captives might be treated.
Giving the crew some control?
Exactly. And maybe even more importantly, pirates often kept the right to depose their captain, to vote him out.
Get rid of him. For what?
All sorts of reasons. If he showed cowardice, if he made bad decisions that cost them loot, even if he refused to attack a ship the crew thought looked promising.
Wow.
So this power of removal, it acted as a pretty big check on the captain's authority. So while it looks a bit like democracy on the surface, the real driver was often the crew's collective self-interest, protecting the venture.
Okay, so the captain wasn't the only one calling the shots. What about other officers? Were there specific roles?
Oh, absolutely. Beyond the captain, you'd typically have a quartermaster, and the quartermaster was often a really key figure.
More than just supplies.
Much more. often involved in distributing the loot, which is huge, and also settling disputes among the crew. Kind of like an HR manager and treasurer rolled into one, but with more swords involved.
Right. Who else?
Then you had the master, who was in charge of navigation, the boatswain who oversaw the ship's rigging, the sails, the crew's daily work, and the gunner, obviously crucial, in charge of the cannons.
And did they get paid more?
Usually, yes. These officers typically had specific duties, and reflecting that importance, they often received slightly larger shares of any plunder, maybe 1.5 shares or 2 shares, compared to a regular crewman's 1 share.
So a hierarchy existed.
Definitely. And just like in the Navy or merchant service, there was a professional hierarchy based on skill and experience too. Able seamen, ordinary seamen, and the new guys, the landsmen. It mirrored what they knew.
Okay, so there was definitely structure, even if it wasn't quite the Royal Navy. Now, what happened if someone broke these pirate rules? What was their justice system like?
Pirate justice is fascinating because, in some ways, it was designed to prevent the very things that made many sailors turn pirate in the first place.
Like what?
Like abusive captains. Protection from excessive cruelty, from being cheated out of wages or food. That was a big deal for many joining up. One source mentions sailors complaining about the too great severity their commanders have used both as to their back and bellies.
So justice was about fairness, or their version of fairness.
To an extent. The fate of captured ships, punishments for fellow pirates who broke the articles. These things could sometimes be decided by a majority vote of the whole crew, or even by a jury.
A pirate jury. You're kidding.
Nope. Some companies, Bartholomew Roberts and John Taylor are the famous examples, are known to have used juries of 12 men to try serious offenses.
Like a real trial.
Sort of. In Taylor's crew, the quartermaster apparently even acted like a prosecutor, presenting the case against the accused.
That's incredible. What kind of punishments are we talking about?
It ranged quite a bit. Could be flogging, fines taken out of their share, but also much harsher things. Marooning was a big one.
Being left on a deserted island? Sounds awful.
It was often basically a death sentence, yeah. And, of course, execution was also an option for serious crimes like mutiny or desertion.
It's pretty severe.
Could be very severe, sometimes even more so than in legitimate society for similar offenses. But even though the articles often spelled out punishments, the crew's collective will could sometimes step in.
How so?
They might decide to be lenient, soften a sentence, or maybe even override the written rules entirely if they felt like it. It wasn't always predictable.
Interesting. Any specific rules that stand out?
Well, it's often noted that rape or mistreating female prisoners was frequently punishable by death, according to the articles. Suggests a specific moral line they drew, even within their lawlessness. And arguments between pirates. Sometimes they settled them with formal fights, almost like duels on shore, first blood usually, to stop festering disputes.
It's a strange mix, isn't it? Formal rules, juries, but also duels, and the potential for the mob to rule. Now, let's shift to the real reason they were there. The loot. How did the economics work? Dividing the plunder.
Right. The prime motivator, as we said, was getting wealthy. Plunder wasn't just gold and jewels, though. No, it was also vital necessities. Food, water, ropes, sails, weapons, medicine, and valuable trade goods, cloth, sugar, rum, tobacco, things they could use or, more importantly, sell.
And how do they sell stolen goods? That seems like a challenge.
It was a huge challenge. They couldn't just sail into London and set up shop. They relied on less than legal trading posts and sympathetic merchants in places like the Caribbean, North America, or even Madagascar. There was a famous trading post run by a guy named Adam Baldridge in Madagascar, a known pirate haven.
A pirate fence, basically.
Exactly. Places where they could trade their stolen cargo for supplies or maybe hard cash, though often at a bad rate.
So the image of burying chests overflowing with gold coins.
Yeah.
Mostly myth.
Largely, yeah. It makes for good stories, but the reality was usually more mundane. The captured loot was typically brought aboard, carefully gathered, counted, sometimes valued by the quartermaster or a committee.
Documented.
Yeah, often documented, before being divided among the whole crew. And that division was supposed to strictly follow the shares laid out in the articles or whatever agreement they'd made.
And was it equal shares for everyone?
That's the popular image, total equality. But in reality, as we mentioned, officers usually got more. Captain, quartermaster, maybe the master, gunner, bosun. They often got 1.5 shares or maybe 2 shares. Skilled specialists like the surgeon or carpenter might also get a bonus.
So egalitarian-ish, but not totally flat.
Right. They also often had a common chess system.
What was that for?
Money set aside from the loot before the main division. It was used for collective expenses, buying bulk supplies, maybe compensating someone badly injured. Some articles even specified payments for losing a limb, for example.
Pirate disability insurance.
Yeah. Kind of, yeah. And sometimes it funded rewards for things like spotting a prize ship first.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the legends are probably true about what happened once they got their share and hit port.
Wine, women, and song.
Pretty much. Reports abound of pirates blowing through huge sums very quickly on drinking, gambling, and general debauchery ashore. Easy come, easy go.
Live fast, die young, spend it all quick. Okay, how did these crews actually get formed and grow? Were they all just hardened criminals eagerly signing up?
It was a mix. Pirate companies definitely had volunteers, guys actively seeking out the life, but they also relied heavily on forced conscription. Press-ganging men from ships they captured.
Why force people? Just for number.
Sometimes just for numbers, yeah. But often it was because they needed specific skills. If they captured a ship with a good surgeon or a cooper who could fix barrels or a skilled navigator, those guys were often forced to join, whether they liked it or not.
Because they were valuable assets.
Exactly. But what's really fascinating is that a lot of those guys who were initially forced, they ended up staying willingly.
Really? Why? Stockholm Syndrome.
Maybe a bit. But more likely, the conditions on the pirate ship, better food, less brutal discipline, and crucially, the potential for a huge payout often looked way more appealing than going back to being an ordinary, poorly paid sailor on a merchant ship.
So desperation and opportunity could turn a forced man into a volunteer.
It seems like it happened quite often. Pragmatic choices, like you said. But there's a flip side to the forced narrative, too.
Oh, yeah.
Some pirates, if they got caught, would claim they were forced as a legal defense.
To try and get off the hook.
Exactly. Pirates would sometimes even put on these elaborate shows when capturing a ship, pretending to force men who might have actually been willing just to create future witnesses. And later, if captured, they might even try to place ads in newspapers back home claiming they'd been unwillingly pressed into service.
Wow, trying to build an alibi after the fact?
Yeah.
Clever, if a bit desperate.
A legal tactic, yeah. Hoping for sympathy from the court.
Right, so looking beyond the big stuff, like loot and leadership, what about just the day-to-day social rules? What else did the articles cover?
Oh, they covered a lot of ground to try and keep order. Things like rules against gambling, especially for high stakes that could cause fights. Setting limits on drinking, particularly after dark when vigilance was needed.
Keeping people sober enough to fight.
Pretty much. Rules about keeping weapons clean and ready at all times. No fighting amongst themselves on board ship. Disputes were often settled ashore, as we mentioned.
Any rules about personal conduct?
Definitely. Some ships had really strict rules against bringing women aboard, sometimes punishable by death. Others banned young boys, too, likely to prevent exploitation or quarrels.
What about dissent? Could you speak freely?
Not entirely. Freedom of speech had its limits, suggesting the company should just give up, disband, or surrender. That could be seen as mutinous talk and might carry a very severe penalty. Loyalty to the company was paramount.
So, trying to keep everyone pulling in the same direction.
Essential for survival. They made real efforts to minimize quarreling and set up procedures, often involving the quartermaster, for settling disagreements before they escalated.
And what about race? We touched on black pirates having maybe more opportunity. How did that dynamic generally play out in the crew?
It's a complex point. While you absolutely cannot ignore the background hum of racism from the era they lived in.
Right, it was deeply ingrained.
The practical realities of life on a pirate ship often forced a different approach. They needed every single able-bodied person to work the ship and fight. Manpower was crucial.
Couldn't afford prejudice.
Often, yes. So black sailors were frequently treated, economically at least, as free men rather than property. They got a share of the plunder, same as white sailors of similar rank or skill. The shared economic interest, the need for solidarity against external threats, it often trumped racial prejudice within the confines of the ship.
So a kind of pragmatic equality driven by necessity.
That seems to be a fair way to put it. A really notable contrast to the brutal realities of slavery dominating the legitimate maritime world and the colonies they raided.
That's a really significant point. Yeah. So this whole era, this golden age of piracy, it obviously didn't last forever. What happened? Why did it decline?
Well, essentially, the party couldn't last. Several big factors came together. Governments, particularly the British government, got much more serious about cracking down.
It had enough.
They'd had enough. They passed stricter anti-piracy laws, offered pardons to encourage pirates to give up, but also ramped up enforcement. The Royal Navy became much more active, much more effective at hunting pirates down.
So the risks just got too high.
Exactly. The cost-benefit calculation started to shift dramatically.
Yeah.
More Navy patrols, more governors actively prosecuting pirates, fewer safe havens to sell goods. It just got harder and harder and riskier.
And many got caught.
A lot of them did. Large numbers were captured, brought to trial, often very swift trials, and executed. Public hangings were common, meant as a deterrent. This systematic pressure effectively dismantled the major pirate crews and scared off many potential recruits. The Golden Age faded.
So the forces of law and order eventually won out.
Yeah.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive then, what are the main takeaways? What should people remember about pirate society?
I think the key thing is its complexity. It was this really fascinating blend of rebellion and imitation.
Rebellion and imitation. How so?
Well, rebellion against the harsh conditions and hierarchies they often came from, but imitation in how they structured their own societies, drawing heavily on the maritime rules and ranks they already knew.
Right. Driven mostly by
The pursuit of wealth, let's be clear. But to achieve that, they developed their own functional, sometimes surprisingly sophisticated systems of order. Rules, leadership, justice, albeit often brutal and self-serving.
So while there were some democratic-ish elements like electing captains or voting on things,
Yeah, those existed, particularly regarding leadership and sometimes major decisions. But their daily lives were still governed by a clear hierarchy. Officers got more loot, skills mattered, and by those very strict articles we talked about.
so the romantic picture, the completely free, egalitarian band of brothers, that's mostly myth.
Largely, yes, it's much more nuanced than that. Many of their practices, from ranks to rules, mirrored the legitimate world they supposedly rejected, just adapted for their specific criminal enterprise, focused on plunder and survival above all else.
This has definitely challenged some of my ideas about pirates. It really makes you think, doesn't it? About how even groups operating outside the law, seemingly lawless groups, can develop their own working systems of order.
Absolutely.
You know, consider that fundamental need for survival, for achieving a common goal, even if that goal is theft on a grand scale. How does that need shape social structures in unexpected ways, even when you throw out the official rule book? It's a fascinating question about the balance between individual freedom and collective necessity.
It really is a profound question about human organization. And for those of you listening who want to dig even deeper, I definitely recommend looking at primary sources like Captain Johnson's General History. Read it with a critical eye, but read it. Or explore some of the modern historical analyses of pirate society. There's just so much more beneath the surface of the yo-ho-ho and the bottle of rum.